Welcome to Imran's Star Video, or as we call it, ISVi, the collaborative lens on Vancouver. Unfiltered, unscripted, and powered by community. We're a collective of creators spotlighting the people, places, and energy that make Vancouver what it is. From downtown buzz to untold stories, we're covering it all. Find us on YouTube, no filters, just real talk. Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and help us grow. This is ISVi. The Downtown Eastside, D.T.E.S. of Vancouver, especially East Hastings Street, is a focal point for homelessness, crime, and drug abuse. Minutes from the city's core, it's ground zero for urban public health and social inequality crises. These issues stem from decades of systemic failures. The Downtown Eastside, D.T.E.S. of Vancouver, especially East Hastings Street, has transformed from a bustling, working-class neighborhood into one of Canada's most visible sites of urban poverty, addiction, and homelessness. Headlines often portray it as a place of despair, but its history reveals decades of systemic failure and urban neglect. To understand the D.T.E.S. crisis, we must trace the socio-economic shifts that turned a thriving community into a flashpoint for housing, mental health, and substance use crises. In the early 20th century, the D.T.E.S. was Vancouver's heart. It housed the city's first theaters, department stores, hotels, and busy intersections. Hastings Street, known as the Golden Mile, was a vibrant commercial strip. The neighborhood was a hub for working-class laborers, including dock workers, loggers, and immigrants, who found affordable housing nearby. For decades, the DTES was an affordable, lively space for newcomers, artists, and low-income workers. The neighborhood's decline began post-WO2, as economic shifts and city planning pulled wealth and infrastructure away. New developments in the West End and False Creek siphoned attention and investment from the DTES. As middle-class families moved out, the area's housing aged and was used for low-income and marginalized populations. The 1960s, 1980s saw deinstitutionalization, discharging psychiatric patients without adequate community support. Large psychiatric hospitals, including Vancouver's Riverview, discharged patients en masse. The necessary social infrastructure was never built to support this transition. Many individuals with chronic mental illnesses ended up homeless or in SRO hotels in the DTES with little access to care. The neighborhood became an informal dumping ground for people with mental health conditions and complex needs, but without resources to help them recover. The 1980s and 1990s saw the rise of hard drugs in the DTES, particularly heroin and crack cocaine. Simultaneously, welfare system restructuring, housing program cuts, and gentrification hit the city. The DTES became the epicenter of Vancouver's drug epidemic. This era also marked the spread of HIV and hepatitis C among people who inject drugs. By the late 1990s, the DTES had the highest rate of HIV infection in the developed world outside sub-Saharan Africa. In response, Vancouver became a global leader in harm reduction. In 2003, it opened InSight, North America's first legal supervised injection site. Located in East Hastings, InSight has reduced fatal overdoses, curbed infectious disease spread, and connected people to services. Its opening marked the start of the city's 4 pillars drug strategy: harm reduction, prevention, treatment, and enforcement. Critics argue InSight was never scaled up or supported with enough housing and mental health supports. Meanwhile, Vancouver's real estate market exploded, especially in the 2000s and 2010s. As the city gained international attention for its livability, affordability vanished. Developers targeted neighborhoods near the D.T.E.S. like Gastown and Chinatown, spurring gentrification. Luxury condos were built blocks from tent encampments and shelters, creating stark wealth and poverty contrasts. These forces displaced DTES residents as SRO hotels were bought out, renovated, or closed, while affordable housing lagged. The fentanyl crisis, starting around 2016, brought a new deadly chapter. Fentanyl in the illicit drug supply led to a steep rise in overdose deaths. This crisis prompted British Columbia to declare a public health emergency. The COVID-19 pandemic worsened everything, isolating vulnerable individuals and reducing access to health services. Today, East Hastings is marked by public drug use, homelessness, and police interventions, surrounded by boutiques and rising property values. Despite the devastation, the DTES has long been a place of resistance, community, and resilience. Indigenous advocacy groups, peer-led organizations, harm reduction workers, and local nonprofits continue to fight for dignity, rights, and systemic change. Residents have built deep community ties in the face of adversity, seeing the DTEs as a symbol of neglect and a fight for justice. The Downtown Eastside, D.T.E.S., is one of Canada's most challenging social policy environments. The crisis here is complex and interconnected. Homelessness, addiction, mental illness, poverty, and crime fuel each other, defying simple solutions. The DTES faces multiple crises, often within the same lives. Homelessness is at crisis levels, with many living in tents or shelters. In 2023, Vancouver recorded its highest number of unhoused individuals, mostly in the DTES. Many live in unsafe SRO hotels or on the streets. These conditions worsen physical and mental health. Lack of stable housing hinders recovery and access to services. The toxic drug supply crisis is closely tied to homelessness. Fentanyl has made drug use more dangerous. Overdoses are a daily occurrence, with many experiencing multiple non-fatal overdoses. Benzodiazepines in the drug supply complicate overdose treatment. Even long-time users face higher risks, and first-time users may die from their first exposure. Co-occurring mental health disorders are chronic and under-addressed. Many suffer from untreated conditions like schizophrenia and PTSD. These often go hand in hand with substance use, forming dual diagnoses. The health system isn't designed to address these complex combinations. Mental health care is fragmented, inaccessible, and underfunded. Without stable housing or long-term treatment, many cycle through emergency rooms, jails, and shelters. Violence is another persistent issue. Many residents are victims of assault, coercion, or robbery. Indigenous women face disproportionate levels of gender-based violence. Increased policing can escalate tensions and re-traumatize residents. Some argue police presence is necessary, while others believe it deepens trauma and distrust. Lack of coordination between government levels and service providers adds to the difficulty. Efforts are often poorly integrated. Organizations compete for limited funding and short-term grants. This fragmented system hinders long-term care and progress tracking. The neighborhood is caught between gentrification and containment. Luxury developments encroach on the DTES, while poverty and services are contained within it. This creates a feedback loop where the DTES is the only place for crisis services. Public perception remains a significant complication. The DTES is often painted as a zone of despair, which dehumanizes residents. Residents are treated as problems to be managed rather than neighbors to be supported. This stigmatization creates barriers to public support for solutions. The DTES continues to bear the brunt of the crisis alone. The complications in the DTES are deeply systemic, rooted in decades of policy failure and neglect. The Downtown Eastside's crisis is disturbingly visible and immediate. Walking down East Hastings, the suffering is evident in the encampments, sirens, and eyes of residents. The DTES reflects untreated trauma, toxic drugs, poverty, and social abandonment. Homelessness is widespread and normalized here. Makeshift tents and shopping carts line East Hastings. Temporary shelters offer little protection, cycling between outdoors, shelters, and SROs. SROs are often unsafe and unsanitary. Lack of stable housing affects every aspect of life. Without a fixed address, accessing services is a struggle. Many lose crucial ID documents due to theft or displacement. This instability creates a sense of perpetual crisis. Open drug use is prevalent. People use substances in doorways, alleys, and sidewalks. Public consumption is the norm due to lack of safe, private places. Harm reduction services like Insight are concentrated here. Overdose emergencies are constant. Individuals are often revived with naloxone on the sidewalk. Many suffer from cognitive impairment or physical injuries due to overdoses. Grief is a daily part of life. Friends and community members frequently die. Some organizations hold memorials weekly or monthly. Untreated mental illness is widespread. Many exhibit symptoms of severe mental health conditions. Few have access to consistent psychiatric care. Symptoms are often misinterpreted as aggression. This leads to harmful encounters with law enforcement. Violence is pervasive. Physical assaults are common in crowded environments. Indigenous women face high rates of sexual violence. Many are involved in survival sex work without protection. Predatory behavior by dealers and traffickers is common. Structural violence denies healthcare, housing, and dignity. Displacement and police interactions re-traumatize residents. These practices often leave people worse off. The emotional atmosphere is a symptom itself. Residents live in constant anxiety and sleep deprivation. Lack of privacy and safety prevents relaxation or recovery. Even housed residents face unpredictability, illness, and loss. Despite challenges, a strong sense of community persists. Residents share food, check on neighbors, and show resilience. Peer support networks and Indigenous-run spaces provide care. Grassroots efforts offer crucial lifelines. The symptoms of the DTES crisis are painfully visible. They reveal a population under siege by drugs, poverty, and systemic failure. The DTES is a place where every symptom is a message of societal neglect. The devastating symptoms observed daily in Vancouver's Downtown Eastside are not isolated occurrences, nor are they the result of individual choices alone. Instead, they are the consequence of long-standing, deeply embedded structural causes that span generations. To fully understand why homelessness, addiction, and mental illness are so concentrated in the DTES, one must examine the social, political, economic, and colonial foundations that created and continue to sustain this crisis. One of the most significant and often overlooked root causes is colonialism and the intergenerational trauma experienced by Indigenous peoples. A disproportionate number of residents in the DTES are Indigenous. In some estimates, Indigenous people make up over 30% of the homeless population in Vancouver, despite accounting for less than 5% of the city's overall population. This stark overrepresentation is not coincidental. It is the direct result of centuries of state-sanctioned policies, such as the residential school system, the 60s scoop, and the systemic removal of Indigenous children from their families into foster care, all of which disrupted culture, family structure, identity, and mental health. These traumas have been passed from one generation to the next, contributing to higher rates of addiction, poverty, and incarceration, and leaving many Indigenous people without support networks or access to culturally appropriate services. Another foundational cause is the deinstitutionalization of mental health care in the mid-20th century. During the 1960s to 1980s, large psychiatric institutions, including Vancouver's Riverview Hospital, were shut down as part of a national shift toward community-based mental health care. However, the necessary community infrastructure was never fully developed or funded. As a result, thousands of people with chronic and severe mental illnesses were discharged into homelessness, with few supports for housing, therapy, or daily functioning. Many ended up in the DTES, where low-barrier housing and anonymity offered the only form of stability. To this day, British Columbia remains under-resourced in community-based mental health care, and many people in crisis continue to fall through the cracks of an uncoordinated and fragmented system. The failure of Canada's housing system is another major contributor to the crisis in the DTES. Over the past 3 decades, there has been a dramatic decline in the construction of non-market, deeply affordable housing, a trend compounded by real estate speculation, gentrification, and the financialization of housing. Vancouver's housing market has become one of the most unaffordable in the world, driven by high land costs, international investment, and limited regulation. For those living in poverty, there are virtually no options. Rental-only zoning and affordable housing incentives have come too slowly to reverse decades of underinvestment. As a result, single-room occupancy hotels, many of which are dilapidated and dangerous, have become the last stop before homelessness. When these units are closed, renovated, or bought by developers, their occupants are often left with nowhere to go. Compounding the housing and mental health issues is the toxic drug supply and lack of accessible addiction treatment. Since the mid-2010s, Canada's illicit drug market has been flooded with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that is exponentially more potent and deadly than heroin or morphine. The increasing contamination of the drug supply with fentanyl and benzodiazepines has caused overdose deaths to spike. Yet despite this known risk, the response has been inadequate. Addiction treatment options remain limited, with long wait lists, restrictive entry criteria, and a lack of trauma-informed, culturally safe care. Many people in the DTES turn to drugs not only because of physical addiction, but because they are coping with pain, trauma, grief, and untreated mental illness, conditions that are rarely addressed holistically in mainstream healthcare settings. A further cause of the crisis lies in the criminalization of poverty and addiction, which has shaped the way cities and governments respond to these problems. For decades, individuals experiencing homelessness or substance use have been managed by law enforcement rather than supported by health or social services. Police encounters, street sweeps, and displacement from encampments are common, despite evidence showing they do not reduce drug use or crime. In fact, these tactics often make people's situations worse by interrupting service access scattering support networks and causing additional trauma. The use of punitive tools instead of preventative and supportive ones reinforces a cycle of marginalization, while also wasting resources that could be better used on housing and healthcare. Adding another layer of complexity is the fragmentation and short-term nature of social services. Nonprofits, outreach teams, shelters, and health programs in the DTES often operate on limited funding with constantly shifting priorities. Many organizations compete for the same grants, which are often project-based and not designed for long-term impact. This creates a piecemeal service environment where individuals must navigate a maze of disconnected agencies to access help, a difficult task even for those not in crisis. The absence of an integrated system of care makes it nearly impossible for many DTES residents to achieve consistent progress in their recovery or housing journey. Finally, one of the most insidious causes is social stigma, the belief, often unspoken, that people who live in the DTES somehow deserve their fate. This stigma is embedded in public narratives, media portrayals, and policy inaction. It allows decision makers and the broader public to view the DTES as other, as a zone of dysfunction rather than a community full of human beings with value and potential. This dehumanization prevents meaningful empathy and stifles political urgency, making it easier to contain suffering than to eliminate it. In summary, the causes of the DTES crisis are deeply systemic and interwoven. They include colonial trauma, deinstitutionalization, a broken housing system, toxic drug policy, the criminalization of poverty, and fragmented care systems, all layered atop one another in ways that make recovery and resolution difficult. These are not new problems, and they are not unique to Vancouver. But the DTES represents one of the most visible manifestations of these failures in Canada, and any real solution must begin by acknowledging how these root causes have shaped and continue to sustain the crisis we see today. Despite the deeply rooted and complex causes of the Downtown Eastside crisis, it is not beyond repair. If anything, the scale and visibility of the suffering demand a response that is equally comprehensive, sustained, and compassionate. There are solutions, real, evidence-based strategies that have been tested in Vancouver and beyond. What has been missing is the coordinated will, long-term investment, and a public understanding that these are not quick fixes, but ongoing commitments to healing and justice. One of the most immediate and impactful solutions is the expansion of permanent supportive housing. Research consistently shows that when people are given safe, stable housing without conditions through models like Housing First, their health outcomes, stability, and chances of recovery increase dramatically. This model has been successfully implemented in parts of Canada, the United States, and Europe. In Vancouver, expanding this kind of housing would require repurposing underused buildings, fast-tracking non-market developments, and purchasing SRO hotels for public ownership. Crucially, housing must be paired with wraparound services, including on-site mental health workers, peer support staff, addiction counselors, and culturally safe programming, particularly for Indigenous residents. Equally important is the need to transform the toxic drug crisis response by expanding access to a regulated, safe supply of substances. People are not dying because they use drugs. They are dying because the drugs available to them are poisoned. Safe supply programs, including medical-grade alternatives like hydromorphone or diacetylmorphine, reduce overdose deaths, criminal activity, and suffering. Pilot programs in Vancouver and Toronto have already shown promising results. These services must be scaled up, destigmatized, and made as accessible as harmful substances are today. At the same time, there must be a radical overhaul of how mental health and addiction services are delivered, rather than relying on emergency rooms, temporary detox beds, and fragmented outreach. Cities like Vancouver should invest in community-based health hubs. These one-stop centers would offer psychiatric care, trauma therapy, medication-assisted treatment, primary care, and wellness supports in a single location, removing the burden from individuals to navigate a confusing patchwork of disconnected services. Such hubs already exist in limited form in parts of British Columbia and have been recommended by health experts for decades. Another critical shift involves reframing public safety by investing in alternatives to policing for nonviolent crises. This includes expanding peer-led crisis response teams, nurse-led mental health teams, and 24/7 community supports that can respond with care instead of force. Programs like Cahoots in Oregon and Vancouver's own CAR 87 model offer blueprints for how to address mental health emergencies without relying on armed police, which can escalate situations and re-traumatize vulnerable individuals. Further, the city and province must commit to ending the containment model, which keeps virtually all services, shelters, and low-income housing concentrated within the few square blocks of the D.T.E.S. Every neighborhood in Vancouver, from Kerrisdale to Kitsilano, should shoulder the responsibility of providing housing and support to people in need. This means equitable zoning, increased public housing outside the D.T.E.S., and a broader narrative shift toward inclusive urban belonging. Just as important as policies are the people and organizations already doing the work. Governments must resource and empower grassroots and Indigenous-led organizations, many of which have deep relationships in the community and offer care that is culturally grounded, trauma-informed, and trust-based. These groups often succeed where large institutions fail because they treat residents with dignity and without judgment. Education and public messaging also play a vital role. Destigmatization campaigns, community storytelling, and open dialogue can challenge the narratives that dehumanize DTES residents. Programs that involve residents in civic planning, art making, and community leadership not only foster connection, but reassert the humanity of those who are too often treated as invisible. The challenges facing East Hastings and the broader DTES are not the result of individual failure. They are the outcomes of decades of policy neglect, inequality, and exclusion. While the problems are deeply rooted, they are not beyond hope. What is required is political will, sustained investment, and the moral clarity to treat poverty, addiction, and homelessness not as crimes, but as complex human conditions that demand compassion and long-term care. Vancouver has the resources and expertise to lead globally in this space, but only if it listens to those who live there. For all its pain, Hastings Street is not just a corridor of crisis, it is a corridor of community, history, and resilience. It has been called many things over the years: Canada's poorest postal code, Ground Zero, the front lines. But to those who live there, it's also home. It's a place where neighbors share what little they have, where harm reduction workers save lives daily, where laughter still echoes between alleys, and where activism has birthed some of the boldest movements in the country. To dismiss the DTES as broken is to ignore the people who hold it together every single day. As Vancouver continues to grow and evolve, the DTES must not be forgotten, gentrified out of view, or pushed to the margins. Instead, it should be seen as a mirror, a reflection of the city's values, its failings, and its potential for compassion. No one left behind should be more than a phrase. It should be policy. And the saying often heard around the city, "East Van don't fold," should be understood not just as a tattoo or a sticker, but as a philosophy, one rooted in survival, in defiance, and in hope. In the words of another local phrase, often said with a mix of grit and pride, we're still here. And if we truly believe in a just and livable Vancouver, we must listen, invest, and walk with those who call the DTES home